Judge slapped Jasmine Crockett with $15,000 fine. She fired back and flipped the script instantly. In just 5 minutes, a powerful judge attempted to silence Jasmine Crockett with a $15,000 fine. No evidence, no hearing, just raw authority abused. But what he didn't anticipate was that this very act would ignite a chain reaction leading to the unraveling of his own career. What should have been a routine procedural hearing spiraled into a gripping showdown between unchecked power and unwavering justice. Could a black woman, armed with nothing but the law and her resolve, bring an entire system to its knees? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second. It was a cold, overcast morning in downtown Chicago. Courtroom 2A was set for a minor procedural check, just a quick review of documentation. But the moment Jasmine Crockett stepped through the doors, she sensed something was off. A seasoned attorney and former prosecutor, Jasmine had been in enough courtrooms to recognize when something wasn't right. The silence was too heavy. The court staff avoided eye contact, and even the walls seemed to be listening. Judge Richard Monroe was already seated, rigid, severe, and notorious for rushing verdicts without giving full arguments a chance. He didn't review files, he handed out judgments. His icy gaze tracked Jasmine as she entered, not with the look of a judge evaluating a legal peer, but like someone confronting a challenge to his control. The courtroom had the feel of a snare, and Jasmine had walked directly into it. The atmosphere wasn't just tense, it was manufactured. Judge Monroe wasn't there to deliver justice. He was there to assert dominance. Monroe's entrance drained the energy from the room. He didn't pause. He didn't greet the court. Without acknowledging counsel, he sat down, adjusted his robe with a single aggressive motion, and looked forward. His voice came next, low, clipped, and unmistakably final. This matter is settled. The defendant is in violation of Code 22F. A fine of $15,000 is to be paid immediately. That is the court's ruling. No preamble, no explanation, no legal process, just a decree, like the case had been concluded long before the doors even opened. Jasmine hadn't even opened her files. Her hands, previously calm on the table, now stiffened slightly, controlled, but alert. Even the prosecutor looked up, puzzled, shifting uneasily in his seat as if he'd missed a crucial segment. But he hadn't. No one had. There had been nothing to miss, no opening arguments, no evidence submitted, no formal proceeding. Just a decision, cold, blunt, and unchallengeable. It was a legal ambush, and Jasmine was expected to accept it and walk away defeated. She didn't. Instead, she sought clarity. "Your Honor," she began cautiously, rising partway from her chair. "With all due respect, we haven't even started. I haven't had the opportunity to present a single point of defense." Monroe's expression hardened, not with reflection, but annoyance. "No need," he barked. "You broke the code. There's no room for discussion." His tone wasn't just dismissive, it was deliberate, cutting, meant to put her in her place. This wasn't a lapse in procedure. It was a power play. "Sit down. Stay quiet. Don't question authority." But Jasmine didn't react the way most would. No yelling, no flustered gestures. She remained composed, standing tall, hands folded calmly in front of her. Her heart may have been racing beneath her blazer, but outwardly, she was a pillar of control. That discipline wasn't accidental. It was earned. Years of courtroom experience had shown her that when power is abused, restraint becomes the sharpest tool. She drew a breath and spoke with deliberate calm. "Your Honor, respectfully, I formally request the opportunity to present my defense. Due process entitles me to be heard." Her words rang through the room, not shouted, but resolute. Not merely invoking law, but affirming principle. She wasn't asking for permission. She was asserting a right. Monroe didn't budge. He didn't even pretend to weigh her words. He stared at her, not with fairness, but with growing disdain. His jaw clenched, eyes narrowing, as if her insistence alone was offensive. He leaned forward, elbows planted on the bench. "Ms. Crockett," he snapped, louder now, "this is not your platform. This is my courtroom. I will not tolerate grandstanding or delays. The words cracked like a whip. The violation is documented. The fine is final. If you want to appeal, do it elsewhere if you get that far. His voice wasn't simply final, it was venomous. Not legal authority, but personal animus. His disdain wasn't professional, it was targeted. A courtroom had become a stage for intimidation, and Jasmine was the focus. Still, she didn't flinch. She stood, motionless, beneath the weight of Monroe's aggression. But internally, her mind was racing, calculating, sharpening. This wasn't just a denial of her rights. It was a performance meant to send a message. Monroe wasn't enforcing the law. He was brandishing it like a weapon. His posture, his refusal to allow her a voice, it all pointed to one conclusion. This judgment had been written long ago, and her presence was just a formality. But this wasn't only about her. This was about control. He wanted to silence her publicly, to make an example, to remind everyone present. Attorneys, clerks, bystanders, that challenging him came with a price. You challenge me, and I will crush you, openly, without hesitation. Jasmine felt it. This wasn't about a code violation anymore. It was about her presence, her confidence, her refusal to bow. Monroe wasn't reacting to a legal infraction. He was responding to her power, to her voice. And now he was determined to strip that voice away, one ruling at a time. The prosecutor averted his eyes. The court reporter's hands hovered above her keys, frozen. The room no longer felt neutral, it had turned adversarial. And yet, in that stillness, Jasmine found clarity. Monroe had made one thing absolutely clear. He had no intention of granting her a fair hearing. He hadn't come to listen. He'd come to dominate. Still, Jasmine didn't sit. She didn't retreat. Her voice dropped in volume but gained force. Then I suppose, she said, eyes fixed on his. We proceed on the record, every word, every step. If the law wouldn't protect her, then the truth would. And every injustice needs a witness. That's when Jasmine made her move. Not through rage, not through rebellion, but with something far more dangerous to someone like Judge Monroe: clarity. She had observed enough by now to see the situation for what it was. This wasn't an oversight. It wasn't haste. It was a calculated act of suppression. She wasn't being fined for violating a code. She was being silenced for who she was, for the strength in her tone, for the resistance in her posture. Everything about Monroe's courtroom had been constructed to send one message. You don't belong here. You might know the law, but I own the bench. He had the gavel, but Jasmine had something more powerful: precedent. As she reached into her folder, the shift in the room was almost palpable. The silence no longer signaled respect. It brimmed with expectation. The kind of quiet that comes right before the first domino falls. She arranged the documents on the desk in front of her, each one a component in a legal mechanism only she could activate. Every page had been selected, annotated, and rehearsed for this exact confrontation. Your Honor, she said, voice steady and precise, we're going to discuss precedent, because what you're doing has already been tried, and it didn't stand. She lifted the first sheet. Sullivan versus State of Illinois, 2017. A defendant fined under a local ordinance. No photos, no inspection report, no affidavit. Just the officer's claim. That case went to appeal. The court found the process unconstitutional and reversed the fine in full. She paused, just long enough to let the weight settle. In its written opinion, she continued, the appellate court stated, quote, where there is no evidence, there is no enforcement. The integrity of due process demands more than assumption. Her tone remained composed. She wasn't performing. She was applying pressure, piece by piece, precedent by precedent. She turned to the next case. Henderson versus City of St. Petersburg, 2019. An officer issued a fine based solely on visual assessment. No photos, no timestamps, no physical documentation. The city argued it was common practice. The court disagreed. In its opinion, the court ruled, administrative authority does not exist in a vacuum. Fines must be grounded in verifiable fact. or they are void under constitutional review. She looked up, meeting Monroe's eyes directly. That ruling had been upheld at every level. For the first time, Monroe shifted. It was subtle, a clench of the jaw, a slight repositioning of his shoulders, but Jasmine caught it. So did everyone else. The clerk resumed typing, this time faster, almost with purpose. The prosecutor uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, hands now clasped together. No longer an advocate, now a witness. Jasmine leaned in too, not physically, but with her presence. "You fined me $15,000, she stated. Without requesting evidence, without permitting argument, without formally opening the hearing. Her voice sharpened, not louder, just more precise. "There is no documentation.
No testimoni.
Only your word. And with all due respect, Your Honor, that is not justice. That is authoritarianism in judicial robes." A ripple of unease passed through the gallery. Attorneys in the back exchanged quick glances. Wordless questions passed between them. Is she really saying this? She was, and she wasn't done. Jasmine tapped the file once more. These cases are not theoretical. They are binding reminders of what this courtroom is meant to uphold. When a judge dismisses procedure, silences defense, and rules without proof, they are not interpreting the law. They are breaking it. And I will not let that happen quietly. She stood firm, unblinking, staring directly at Monroe. Her voice dropped to nearly a whisper, but it struck like thunder. You can ignore my argument, but you cannot erase precedent. And you will not rewrite the Constitution from behind that bench. Judge Monroe didn't respond at first, but Jasmine noticed it, the subtle shift. His jaw tightened, his gaze wavered, just for a moment, toward the clerk, then the prosecutor's table. His fingers, which had rested still on the bench, began tapping, slow and uneven. He was calculating. Until now, every move he'd made relied on dominance, on fear, on the belief that Jasmine would back down, that she'd falter. But now, the very platform he stood on was beginning to crack. Jasmine hadn't just defended herself. She had done it with exacting precision. Backed by appellate rulings and constitutional language, he couldn't dismiss without discrediting the very institution he claimed to serve. And that, more than anything else, unnerved him. When his voice finally emerged, it had lost its former edge. This court will recess for 15 minutes, he said abruptly, then stood, offering no explanation, no acknowledgement, no eye contact. It was an escape disguised as protocol, a retreat cloaked in formality. The bailiff acted quickly, opening the door to chambers as Monroe slipped through it, his robe trailing behind like a shield he no longer wore with confidence. But Jasmine understood exactly what had just happened. That wasn't a pause to weigh evidence, it was a tactical retreat. A break to regroup, to make a call, to dig up anything that might discredit her, derail her argument, or delay the inevitable. Because now, he wasn't just facing a lawyer, he was facing accountability. For a moment, the courtroom remained frozen, as though uncertain whether it had permission to exhale again. The clerk looked visibly shaken, her eyes flickering toward Jasmine but never quite meeting hers. The prosecutor sat stiffly, his expression blank, but his fingers twitched restlessly in his lap. Jasmine, however, didn't move. She stayed standing, her posture upright, her hands still resting gently on the stack of legal precedents she had just laid down like live ammunition. She wasn't looking for validation. She was scanning the room, and what she saw was exactly what Monroe feared most: doubt. Doubt creeping into the cracks of his authority. Doubt spreading across every silent observer who had just witnessed what few dared to confront out loud. That even a judge could be wrong. Even a judge could be cornered. He had asked for 15 minutes. But Jasmine knew better. This wasn't 15 minutes for introspection. It was 15 minutes to protect himself. He'd try to reshape his narrative, adjust his strategy, maybe even bring in backup. Because the only thing more threatening than a well-prepared attorney is one who is fearless, grounded in truth, and unwilling to back down under pressure. Jasmine had just crossed a threshold most never even approached. She didn't simply request fairness. She forced the courtroom to look at its own imbalance. And Monroe, for all his years on the bench, had no roadmap for that. As the clock ticked on, the room settled into an uneasy, fragile quiet. Jasmine stayed motionless, focused, poised, unshaken. The judge had stepped away to regain footing, but she wasn't going anywhere, not until every corner of that courtroom remembered what it meant to uphold justice. When the door to Monroe's chambers finally opened, every head turned, and then furrowed in confusion. Judge Monroe returned, but this time he wasn't alone. Trailing behind him was another figure.
Taller.
Older, with a gait that carried unmistakable institutional weight. Judge Thomas Whitaker. His black robe seemed heavier than Monroe's, the fabric moving with the kind of deliberate authority only earned through decades on the federal bench. The room shifted instantly. This wasn't about numbers anymore. It was about what his presence signified. A low murmur stirred through the gallery. Not curiosity, unease. Even the court officer straightened, realizing this hearing had just shifted from routine to something far more volatile. Jasmine didn't need anyone to explain what this meant. You don't summon Judge Whitaker into a hearing like this unless something is unraveling, and Monroe, for all his bravado, had finally sensed the walls closing in. Monroe returned to his seat, his voice stripped of the command it once held. "For the record," he said, clearing his throat, "I have invited Judge Whitaker to observe and, if needed, offer guidance on certain procedural matters that have come up." It was a statement carefully worded to sound impartial, routine. But everyone in that courtroom could hear the truth beneath it. He was losing control, and now he needed someone with more stature to stabilize the courtroom before it fell apart. Monroe didn't look at Jasmine. He couldn't, not after the way she had methodically dismantled his prior ruling. Instead, he leaned back slightly, as if retreating into his chair, allowing Whitaker's presence to take over the authority he could no longer command. Jasmine stood calmly, but her senses sharpened. She had read about Whitaker, a former appellate judge, now a senior federal overseer. Known for his sharp intellect, relentless legal scrutiny, and ironclad control over courtroom procedure. He didn't need to raise his voice, he never had to. A single glance from him could silence a room faster than a dozen objections. Now that glance landed on Jasmine, not with hostility but with focused, piercing assessment. He wasn't just listening to her words. He was studying her bearing, her breath, the rhythm of her silence. And Jasmine understood exactly what that meant. She was no longer simply defending herself against a biased ruling. She was now standing before the system itself. Still, she didn't flinch. She met his gaze a moment longer than necessary, her chin raised, her stance firm. She wasn't intimidated, but she was alert. This wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It had become a battlefield between legacy and reform, between unearned authority and credibility earned in real time. Monroe had called in Whitaker, hoping to tilt the balance, to silence her voice with seniority and hierarchy. But Jasmine carried something neither of them could override: legal precedent, constitutional grounding, and a clear record of being correct. This wasn't merely a defense anymore. It had become a direct challenge to the power structure itself that had allowed Monroe to operate without scrutiny for years. Whitaker adjusted his robe, glanced at the case file laid before him on the bench, and finally spoke. His voice was calm, measured, but carried undeniable authority. "Miss Crockett," he said, "you've raised multiple constitutional issues regarding the application of Code 22F. I'd like you to reiterate your central argument for the record." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a challenge, a live examination, and Jasmine understood. She had walked into a courtroom that had been stacked against her, dismantled the trap, and now had to defend her position under federal scrutiny. One mistake and it could all collapse, but one exact, decisive statement, and she wouldn't just withstand the pressure. She'd command the room. Without glancing down, without the slightest hesitation, she replied, "Yes, Your Honor. I'll begin with the due process violations, supported by appellate precedent." Her voice didn't simply respond, it asserted. The rules had shifted, the power dynamic had changed, and Monroe knew it. Whitaker was there to evaluate the law, but the courtroom had already begun to lean toward Jasmine. The chamber fell into a cold, resonant silence. Jasmine stood firmly at the defense table, her hand lightly touching the edge of her leather-bound folder. She remained motionless as the bailiff called out, "Officer Nathan Ellis to the stand." From the rear of the courtroom, a man stood with the rigid posture of someone convinced he owed no explanations to anyone. His dark blue uniform was immaculate, his badge gleaming as if freshly polished for this exact occasion. He moved with the ease of someone who hadn't been questioned in decades. That was about to end. Jasmine observed him with surgical focus. Ellis never looked her way. He stared straight ahead like a man checking off a task he'd completed countless times. He placed his left hand on the Bible, raised his right, repeated the oath, and then sat, hands folded, posture confident, as if he already knew how this would unfold. Jasmine took 3 slow, deliberate steps toward the witness box. Not hurried, not theatrical, just enough to let him and everyone else feel the weight of what was coming. "Officer Ellis," she began, her tone composed but firm. "You issued the citation that led to the fine imposed on me, correct?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied smoothly, maybe too smoothly. "And that citation was based on a violation you claimed to personally witness?" "That's right." She nodded slightly. "Let's break that down. Did you document the alleged violation with any photographs?" "No, ma'am," he answered, shaking his head. "Didn't need to." Her voice didn't rise, but the room's temperature dropped. "Did you file a detailed incident report?" "No." "No diagram? No witness affidavit? No time-stamped footage from a city camera?" "None required," Ellis said with a casual shrug. "Was there anyone else present during this supposed violation?" "No. I was alone." Jasmine paused for just one long beat. Then she pivoted slightly toward the gallery and the bench, her voice slow and methodical. "So, to clarify, you issued a $15,000 fine based solely on your personal judgment, with no photographic proof, no written report, no third-party confirmation, and 0 corroborating documentation?" "Yes," he answered, this time with a hint of frustration. "I've been doing this for over 20 years. I know what a violation looks like." There it was, the arrogance, the assumption that experience equals impunity. Jasmine's lips curled into a subtle, deliberate smile. Not smug, strategic. "I'm sure you do, officer," she said, her voice smooth, laced with a fine thread of steel. "But we're not here to assess your instincts. We're here to talk about evidence." Ellis shifted in his seat. It wasn't a dramatic move, but it was telling. The confidence that had carried him to that chair now wavered. She stepped a little closer. "Do you believe that your personal judgment, without any supporting evidence, is sufficient to override a citizen's due process rights in federal court?" His brow creased. "I believe my experience allows me to make sound decisions in the field." "Judgments," Jasmine clarified, her tone growing cooler. "Yes, but fines? Legal penalties? Consequences that carry constitutional weight." She turned back toward the bench. "Your honors, what we have here isn't law enforcement. It's presumption. Not legal procedure, it's projection. Officer Ellis didn't witness a crime. He interpreted one, and then treated that interpretation as binding law." She returned her gaze to Ellis. "Can you identify anything in the citation file, anything at all, that constitutes physical, verifiable evidence?" "No, ma'am," he said, quieter now. Jasmine didn't press further. She let the silence expand. A long, measured pause. Every pair of eyes in the room was on her. She turned back toward the bench, her voice sharper now. "Your Honor Whitaker, Your Honor Monroe, this officer has just confirmed, under oath, that his entire case rests on subjective interpretation. Not on probable cause, not on measurable criteria, just a personal impression." She tapped the edge of her folder. "And yet a $15,000 fine was issued, not based on documentation or proof, but on what one individual thought he saw." Whitaker leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlocked. He didn't speak, but the silence no longer felt impartial. Jasmine stepped forward again, lowering her voice with intention. "This isn't about Officer Ellis. It's about the standard we uphold in a court of law. If this is permitted to stand, if a fine can be imposed without a single piece of real evidence, then every citizen is just one moment away from financial ruin. She looked to the gallery. Faces stiffened, some startled, others visibly unsettled. Toward the back, a few younger attorneys appeared newly awakened, like they were watching injustice get surgically exposed in real time. She turned back to Ellis and locked eyes. Because what Ellis calls enforcement, our Constitution calls arbitrary. And the courts? They call it unconstitutional. Final question, Officer Ellis. If someone were to dispute your citation, like we are doing now, what evidence would you provide to support your decision? Ellis looked toward the judges, then at Jasmine. He hesitated, his throat bobbing slightly as he swallowed. I would say that I acted in accordance with my training and experience, he finally answered. Noted, Jasmine responded, her tone as sharp as cut glass. So, we're left with this. A $15,000 penalty based solely on one man's recollection, with no physical proof and zero oversight. Then she said it, the line that cracked the courtroom wide open. So, what you're calling a citation, officer, is really just your opinion, dressed in uniform. A fine disguised as personal belief. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was electric, heavy. Every person in that courtroom felt the weight of what had just been spoken. The state's argument wasn't just weak. It was hollow. The emperor had no clothes, and Jasmine had exposed it with the precision of a surgeon. Whitaker leaned back slightly in his chair. Monroe stared down at his bench, his lips pressed into a thin line. The prosecutor didn't respond, because to say anything now in defense of Ellis would only highlight how far this case had veered off course. Jasmine took a single step back, not as a retreat but as a closing move. Her message had landed. The very system that had tried to bulldoze her now sat paralyzed in silence, facing the undeniable truth she had pulled into the light. You cannot punish without proof. Not in this courtroom. Not today. Not anymore. Jasmine turned again toward the bench, her hand resting calmly atop the open folder, now laid out like a loaded weapon. Her voice lowered, not out of uncertainty, but because she wanted everyone in the room to lean in and listen. Your Honors, she said, meeting Whitaker's eyes, then Monroe's. You've heard the legal precedent. You've heard the procedural breakdown. But let's not pretend this is still about paperwork. This is about people, real people, who never had the chance to stand where I'm standing. People who were crushed under the weight of invisible authority. Just like I almost was today. She slowly turned a page in her folder, then held it up. Let me introduce you to Daniel Rhee.
Việt Nam veteran.
Lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Came back from the war with shrapnel in his leg and a dream in his heart to open his own repair garage. He spent 20 years building it, saved every dollar, rebuilt transmissions by hand, helped fellow veterans for free when they were struggling. Then her tone shifted, somber and steady. And one day, out of nowhere, the city emailed him. His business license was suspended, not revoked for wrongdoing, not flagged for safety issues, suspended because of an administrative error. His online renewal was missing one checkbox, just one. No phone call, no warning, just a red line of text in a government system. She let that moment linger. The judges didn't move. The gallery remained frozen. He tried to appeal. No one listened. They said the system had auto-flagged his record. And while he fought that invisible machine, his customers left. Rent accumulated. Within 3 months, Daniel lost everything. His garage, his livelihood, then his house. She paused. The city admitted their mistake. 6 months later. You know what they gave him? Jasmine's voice cracked, just slightly. A typed apology letter. No name.
No signature.
She turned the page. Karen Bautista, Savannah, Georgia, master electrician. 15 years, no accidents, no citations. She trained apprentices, ran her own crew. Then 1 year, the city updated the licensing codes quietly, without warning. Suddenly, her state license was labeled non-transferable under revised municipal guidelines. No one could explain what that meant. Not the board. Not the clerk. But they told her she couldn't pull permits anymore. Couldn't inspect. Couldn't work. They told her to start over, as if her entire career had been erased. She fought. She demanded clarification. Filed a public records request. They denied it, called the new policy internal. Jasmine inhaled, then slowly released her breath, steadying not just herself but the entire pulse of the room. She fixed her gaze on Monroe. Her voice narrowed into a blade. "And what did they call that decision, Your Honor?" "Standardization. That's the term they used. Cold. Bureaucratic. Standardization." She let the word hang there. She eventually moved to Florida to begin again, lost her team, her contracts, her home, her name, and no one was ever held responsible. And then came the final story. She placed one more page on the stack, then looked out toward the gallery before speaking. James Weller, 62, retired long-haul truck driver, lived just outside Waco, Texas, used his pension to buy a small piece of land, built a cedar fence with his own hands. It extended 17 inches over the city's invisible property boundary. 17. The city claimed he was encroaching on public land, issued a fine over $10,000. When he asked for a land survey, they told him, quote, "It's already been decided." He couldn't afford a lawyer, couldn't appeal, so he tore the entire fence down himself by hand. In the heat, in the dust. Took him 2 days. Jasmine's voice dropped to a whisper. On the third day, they find him again, this time for incomplete demolition, because a few posts were still in the ground. The courtroom was a vacuum now. No one shifted. No one cleared their throat. Even Monroe had stopped pretending to stay busy. Everyone felt it, the gravity of what Jasmine had just unearthed. These weren't statistics. They were wounds. They were the proof that when a system is left to feed its own ego, it turns predatory. Jasmine directed her full focus on Judge Whitaker. "So let's stop pretending this is merely a hearing about a minor fee. Let's stop acting like I'm the only one this has ever happened to." Her voice rose, not in anger, but in conviction. What happened to Daniel, Karen, and James wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a technical glitch. It was power with no limits, a system that can demolish a life without ever having to prove a single thing. And it's the same force that almost steamrolled me today. She raised her hand, palm up. No evidence.
No documentación. No hay witnesses.
Just one officer's personal assessment, and a courtroom ready to endorse it without hesitation. What if I hadn't walked in here with this folder? What if I hadn't studied the law? What if I had just paid the fine like most people do and walked away believing I had done something wrong? She glanced around the room. That's how it starts. That's how people surrender. That's how injustice survives. It hides behind the mask of official procedure and waits for someone too tired or too uninformed to fight it. Her gaze returned to Whitaker, her voice now low but unshakable. Unchecked power is not justice. It is a loaded weapon in the hands of those who forget who they're supposed to serve. Then she delivered the final line, the one that brought the courtroom to the brink. Power that answers to no one doesn't protect the people. It hunts them, slowly, quietly, until one day, it knocks on your door, and there's no one left to stand in its way. And for a long moment, not a single word was spoken, because there was nothing left to say. The silence after Jasmine's words wasn't just heavy, it was suffocating. It cloaked the entire courtroom like a storm on the verge of breaking. Judge Monroe stared at her just a bit too long. His lips compressed into a severe line as though measuring the fallout of what he was about to say. His fingers twitched once against the polished wood of his bench. He looked down, then back up and finally spoke, not with the booming authority he had once used, but with a colder, calculated resistance. "This court," he began slowly, "retains the right of judicial discretion. We are not required to accept every argument simply because it is passionately delivered." His tone was firm but hollow. "When necessary, this court exercises its authority to preserve order and ensure compliance. That authority," he added, "is not subject to debate." It was a thin veil, a last, desperate attempt to reassert control. Not by law, by ego. Everyone felt it. This wasn't justice speaking. It was a man clinging to the last thread of influence slipping through his fingers. He wasn't defending the ruling, he was defending himself. Jasmine didn't respond immediately. She let the silence settle, let his words hang, unsupported. Then she took a single step forward. Her voice, quieter now, sliced through the air like a scalpel. "Your Honor," she said, locking eyes with Monroe. "Judicial discretion does not equal judicial supremacy. The authority of this bench, or any bench, exists only within the boundaries of the law." She turned slightly, now addressing the entire courtroom. "Discretion is not a shield for mistakes. It is not a weapon for prejudice. It is a tool meant to be used sparingly and with precision, never as a substitute for proof, and never as a replacement for truth." She faced Monroe again, her voice tightening. "This fine was imposed without records, no hard evidence, no third-party confirmation, just a single officer's unsupported statement. You called it enforcement, but what it really is assumption. A $15,000 penalty based entirely on a feeling. That's not discretion. That's lawlessness." Draped in robes, Monroe's jaw tensed. For a moment, it looked as though he might lash out, raise his voice, issue another blanket dismissal. But before he could, Judge Whitaker leaned forward. He hadn't spoken in several minutes, but now his words came slowly, deliberately. "I've heard enough," he said, not loudly, but with a gravity that silenced everything else. "Miss Crockett is correct. Judicial discretion cannot override constitutional standards. It cannot replace fact with supposition." The effect of those words landed like a gavel strike. You could feel the shift in the room. Stillness swept through the gallery. No murmurs, no shifting. Even Monroe didn't look at Whitaker. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what it meant. The moment Whitaker gave his agreement, the foundation of Monroe's entire argument gave way beneath him. Whitaker continued, his voice measured but resolute. "In this case, we have no supporting documents, no corroborating witness, no tangible evidence to support the penalty. The officer's claim, unverified and uncorroborated, fails to meet the evidentiary standard required for enforcement." He paused, not for emphasis, but for clarity. This court cannot and must not uphold a fine based solely on personal interpretation. To do so would establish a precedent not of justice, but of unchecked authority. Monroe sat motionless now, his hands clenched tightly together. He remained silent, not because he chose to, but because there was nothing he could say that wouldn't worsen the damage. His authority had been confronted, and then dismantled, in full view of the very people he once subdued with silence. He had tried to replace process with presence, replace precedent with posture. And now, stripped of that illusion, he had no ground left. Finally, after a silence that stretched nearly unbearable, Monroe leaned forward, slightly. When he spoke, his voice was thin and strained. "This court," he began, eyes lowered, "finds that there is insufficient evidentiary basis to uphold the fine imposed under Municipal Code 22F. He swallowed once, the gavel still untouched beside him. "Accordingly, the fine is vacated. The charge is dismissed." The words lingered, not as a celebration, but as a recognition of failure, of overreach, of a system that had nearly crushed someone who simply chose not to yield. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't smile. She didn't even nod. She stood still, collected, composed, as if the outcome had always been inevitable. And for her it was, not because the system had worked as it should, but because she had made it work. The gallery remained frozen, stunned. Even the prosecutor sat unmoving, hands clasped tightly, eyes cast downward. No one spoke, yet everyone understood what had just unfolded. Jasmine hadn't merely won a legal argument. She had uncovered something rotten. She had stepped into a courtroom where the odds were stacked against her. Timing, demeanor, reputation, even the judge himself. And she had dismantled it, piece by piece, using only the truth, the law, and unwavering clarity. Judge Monroe, the man who had entered the day cloaked in absolute authority, now sat in silence, outflanked, outmatched, undone. And in that silence, the message rang loud and clear. The court had not ruled in Jasmine's favor. It had yielded to her unwillingness to disappear. This was not just a fine being dismissed. This was a system being reminded forcefully of its true purpose. The courtroom fell into a silence so deep that even the hum of the overhead lights seemed to still in respect of what had just taken place. The day had started with the kind of quiet tension that promised nothing more than a routine bureaucratic hearing, a case that should have been just another footnote on the docket. But as the hours passed, the space had transformed into a crucible of power, prejudice, and unflinching truth. And now, with the final decision delivered, and the weight of injustice still hanging thick in the air, the scene before the judges, attorneys, and every quiet observer was one of irreversible transformation. Judge Monroe, whose early statements had radiated with unopposed authority, now sat completely still behind the bench, eyes fixed on the worn wood below. The control he had clung to had dissolved beneath the force of Jasmine Crockett's relentless demand for fairness. It was in that charged moment, the courtroom frozen in stillness, that the inevitable collision with truth had begun. A truth that refused to be silenced by position or power, no matter how formally draped in black robes. After what felt like an endless pause, Monroe's eyes finally rose to meet Jasmine's steady gaze. His voice, once thunderous and commanding, came out quiet, almost resigned. "I underestimated you." The words, quietly spoken yet heavy with reluctant admission, pierced the silence like a shard of ice. They weren't intended for the gallery. They were a private concession, an acknowledgement of his failure to grasp the strength of her determination. Jasmine, standing tall at the front of the courtroom, allowed the faintest smile to tug at the corners of her mouth. It wasn't a smile of victory. It was one of quiet affirmation. "You wouldn't be the first, sir," she replied, her voice soft but unmistakably firm. It carried through the room like a chord struck with perfect pitch, echoing calm defiance that resonated with everyone present. In that fleeting exchange, the dynamic of the courtroom shifted forever. The oppressive weight of unquestioned authority lifted, just slightly, replaced by a rising awareness that justice, real justice, demanded more than hierarchy. It required accountability. For a long moment, the room remained suspended in a bittersweet stillness. The silence was not void, it was full, brimming with the collective recognition that what had occurred transcended legal victory. It was the birth of a new precedent, one that would echo far beyond these walls. Without another word, Jasmine turned away from the bench. Each step she took down the polished marble aisle was deliberate, her heels clicking in steady rhythm like punctuation to the day's revolution. Every stride echoed the hours of preparation, the unseen battles fought in smaller rooms, and the courage summoned in moments when injustice threatened to crush anyone without power. The gallery watched her pass in awed silence. Row after row of spectators sat motionless, many of them finally realizing they were witnessing more than the outcome of a hearing. They were witnessing a shift in the very bones of the justice system. Her deliberate walk forward was a quiet but undeniable statement. Even when power is abused and the balance of justice is warped by unchecked authority, the voice of truth can still rise to reclaim what is rightfully owed. Outside, the hallways of the courthouse echoed with the steady rhythm of her steps, a sound that carried far beyond the cold stone walls of legal process. The light pouring through the grand entrance seemed to carry symbolism of its own. Transparency breaking through the shadows of corruption, hope dissolving the fog of concealed abuses. As Jasmine reached the heavy oak doors, she paused briefly. Glancing back one last time, she took in the room, the place where Monroe's defeat was etched not only on his furrowed brow but in every silent look of respect from those who had chosen to stand with her. In that moment, every set of eyes, from the youngest clerk to the most seasoned lawyer, understood a truth they could no longer ignore. The law was never meant to be a weapon of oppression. It was meant to be a shield for the people. The door creaked open, and with one final, purposeful step, Jasmine exited into the courtyard, now bathed in soft, forgiving light. The noise of the outside world resumed, as if bowing to the significance of what had transpired. But within her, the victory was not loud. It was not about applause or headlines. It was a milestone etched into the legacy of that courtroom, one that would shape every case that followed. Where power threatened to suffocate justice, the injustice Jasmine had faced was anything but rare. It was systemic, entrenched in a culture of unchecked authority that had long suppressed the voices of the marginalized. Yet by standing firm and demanding accountability, she had carved out a path for change. Her actions that day served as a reminder. True power does not lie in the ability to silence dissent, but in the bravery to confront it head-on. Every moment of that day would be remembered. The cold, deliberate tone of Monroe's ruling, the thick tension that had filled every inch of the courtroom, and the collective breath the gallery had held as the verdict was delivered. These moments, seemingly minor yet profoundly significant, were sparks capable of igniting a wider movement for justice. The injustice of a fine imposed without evidence, the arrogance of a system that presumed guilt without proof. These were not anomalies. They were chapters in a much larger story. And now, due to Jasmine's unshakable resolve, that story had been interrupted. Within the courtroom, a quiet but unmistakable shift had begun. Judges who once handed down decisions with an unyielding grip might now hesitate before issuing rulings devoid of due process. Prosecutors who had long operated comfortably within the confines of an unjust system might now find themselves challenged by the very precedents they had once ignored. And for every citizen who had felt the sting of arbitrary authority, those who had lost jobs, dignity, or even homes, there now stood a symbol of hope. In Jasmine's calm defiance, in her firm pursuit of the truth, lay the promise of accountability. When left unchecked, the law becomes a weapon, a tool for the powerful to suppress the vulnerable. But when wielded by those who honor its principles, it transforms into a shield. Today, Jasmine had reminded the world that this shield could be reclaimed, that even in the face of overwhelming institutional power, justice could still find its way. As the courtroom slowly began to clear, murmurs of conversation floated upward, soft at first, then gradually louder, as if everyone was trying to piece together what they had just witnessed. Some whispered about the sheer improbability of the moment, a judge conceding fault, a system buckling under the pressure of its own hypocrisy. Others, in hushed voices, spoke of Jasmine's courage, reverently analyzing the implications of her actions for the cases yet to come. Every murmur, every exchanged glance confirmed what was already known. This was no ordinary dismissal. This was a landmark moment, a turning point in the ongoing fight against systemic injustice. Even Judge Whitaker, whose calm authority had been a steady presence throughout the proceedings, now seemed to exude a quiet conviction. His eyes, once filled with calculated scrutiny, now held a glimmer of contentment, a silent affirmation that, for once, the scales of justice had tilted as they should. And though Judge Monroe had ultimately been forced to vacate the fine, his role in the drama had reached its end. The finality of his statement, "The fine is hereby vacated, the charges dismissed," was not so much a declaration of victory as it was a confession, a reluctant acknowledgement that his earlier position could no longer stand. It was as though he had been caught in the act of distorting the law and, left with no other option, had withdrawn in quiet defeat. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of that day extended well beyond the courthouse. Legal publications cited the case as a pivotal example in administrative law, proof that unchecked authority could be dismantled by one determined voice demanding what was right. Law schools would reference the hearing as a critical shift in interpreting judicial discretion, and practicing attorneys would recall the day as one when the very heart of due process had been boldly defended. But for Jasmine, the meaning was intensely personal. This wasn't just about erasing a fine, it was about reclaiming a dignity long eroded by systemic bias and bureaucratic neglect. Every step she took that day, from the moment she entered the courtroom to the final echo of her heels as she exited, was a symbol of perseverance. A reminder that the law, when upheld properly, isn't a tool for domination but a mechanism for fairness. A structure meant to ensure that every person, regardless of background or status, is granted a fair hearing. As she stepped into the light outside the courthouse, the world itself seemed to exhale, as though the weight of injustice had, if only briefly, been lifted. Jasmine's journey was far from finished. More battles would come. More moments when the system would attempt to silence reason through red tape and authority. But on that day, within those solemn courtroom walls, she had proven something essential: that even the most fortified power could be challenged. That the law was not an unchangeable decree of the elite, but a living, breathing promise to safeguard the vulnerable. It was a promise she had renewed with every argument, every citation, every deliberate step. As the courtroom doors closed behind her, sealing off the place where history had just been reshaped, a sense of unwavering determination remained. The echoes of her stand would linger in those halls, a constant reminder that when authority is left unchallenged, it becomes a threat. But when questioned, when held to account, that same power can be used not to oppress, but to uplift. And the precedent she had set that day came not with a parade or fanfare, but with silence, strength, and truth. But with the steady, unwavering march of truth, echoed by a woman who refused to be silenced. The moment crystallized. As the soft light of the afternoon streamed through the tall windows, casting long, dramatic shadows across the polished floor, everyone present felt the shift. The scales of justice had, if only briefly, tilted in favor of accountability. Though the victory came without celebration or applause, it was a triumph nonetheless. A triumph of integrity over corruption, of facts over assumptions, of due process over authoritarian discretion. Jasmine walked out of that courtroom not as a conquering hero, but as someone who had carried the weight of injustice, and by standing firm, had managed to lift a small portion of it. Her eyes held the unspoken promise of battles still ahead, a silent commitment that she would never again permit unchecked power to trample the rights of the few. And as the courthouse doors swung shut behind her, sealing off the remnants of that pivotal day, the legacy of her courage began to seep into every corner of the legal system. It became a legacy that would remind future generations that no one is above the law, and that often the most meaningful victories are the legal precedents that force institutions to evolve. In the days, months, and years that followed, those who had observed the trial would speak of it with reverence and care. Legal experts would dissect its consequences, referencing the case as a milestone in holding judicial overreach accountable. Aspiring lawyers would carry the memory of that moment as a guiding light, a symbol that the law, when wielded with honor, could be both a sword and a shield. And for every individual who had ever felt powerless in the face of bureaucratic abuse, Jasmine's steadfast resistance would become an emblem, a living testament that even in the darkest hour, a single voice grounded in truth could reshape the course of history. The courtroom had not merely hosted a legal decision. It had witnessed a metamorphosis, a transformation of power, of procedure, and of the shared understanding of what it meant to deliver true justice. And though Judge Monroe's closing remarks had been uttered in a voice softened by defeat, the message that rang through the courthouse was unmistakable. Justice without evidence and due process is merely a hollow structure. It is a system that must be challenged, scrutinized, and ultimately corrected. Jasmine's quiet exit marked not a conclusion, but the dawn of a new era, an era in which every judgment would be examined, every penalty validated, and every act of enforcement anchored in provable fact. As she disappeared into the waning light, her silhouette merged with the courthouse shadows, leaving behind an unforgettable impression on the hearts and minds of all who had been there that day. It served as a reminder that while the fight against systemic injustice may be long and arduous, each victory, each legal precedent, moves us closer to a reality in which power is genuinely held accountable, and every person receives the dignity and protection they are owed. And so, the day came to a close not with the celebratory roar of conquest, but with a solemn recognition of a hard-won truth. Real justice is not gifted by the whims of a judge. It is earned through unwavering bravery, persistent questioning, and the firm refusal to let authority go unchallenged. Jasmine Crockett had not only reclaimed her dignity, she had reignited a flame, one that would illuminate the path for all who believe that the law should serve the people, not the other way around. In the weeks that followed Jasmine Crockett's landmark courtroom success, a ripple of reform began to spread through cities nationwide. Municipal offices, which had long depended on unchecked discretion, were abruptly forced to reassess hundreds of fines imposed without a shred of substantiating evidence. It began in a small Midwestern town where a local lawyer's inquiry into an arbitrary $15,000 fine uncovered that over 100 penalties had been issued solely on the basis of an officer's personal judgment. One by one, cities across the country found themselves compelled to dig through historical records and reevaluate enforcement procedures that had long been cloaked in bureaucratic opacity. What they uncovered was staggering. Thousands of citizens had been financially devastated by fines that lacked any physical proof, eyewitness accounts, or objective metrics. Public outrage erupted as communities began to realize these penalties, once thought to be mere administrative mishaps, were symptomatic of a widespread failure that allowed unchecked authority to dominate. The revelation sent shockwaves through local governments, who now faced intense media attention and the urgent need for reform. Officials scrambled to justify how such fines had been imposed purely on the word of a single officer, often without any corroborating data. Many found themselves under the harsh scrutiny of a furious public. Within mere weeks, the narrative had evolved, from isolated cases to a sweeping national reckoning with administrative abuse. Jasmine Crockett's triumph in that defining courtroom moment became the spark that lit a countrywide push for justice. Her case, thoroughly documented and fearlessly presented, was soon hailed by legal experts and advocates as a defining moment. It didn't take long before cities across the nation began re-examining their own enforcement records. In several municipalities, hundreds of fines were rescinded. After it was revealed that fines had been imposed without proper evidence, officials in boardrooms and city council meetings were forced to face an uncomfortable truth. A system that allowed penalties to be based on personal judgment rather than verifiable facts was fundamentally flawed and dangerous. Grassroots organizations mobilized, demanding that local governments implement stricter guidelines for evidence-based enforcement and hold officers accountable for arbitrary decisions. The momentum behind this movement was undeniable. Communities that had once felt powerless in the face of bureaucratic overreach now found their voices amplified. Protests erupted in public forums where citizens demanded transparency and the assurance that no one would ever again bear the consequences of an officer's unchecked discretion. Through each new policy revision and every rescinded fine, Jasmine's case became a beacon of hope, a potent reminder that when the people demand accountability, even the most powerful institutions can be forced to change. As the story gained traction, the media continued to shine a bright light on the far-reaching reforms that were unfolding. Television stations, newspapers, and online outlets ran continuous coverage of the emerging changes. Major news programs returned with follow-up reports on the comprehensive audits that showed how cities in Texas, Florida, and New York were struggling with the aftermath of a system that had long operated without proper oversight. In one notable segment, 60 Minutes aired interviews with former victims of arbitrary fines, business owners, veterans, and ordinary citizens whose stories resonated with audiences across the nation. These personal accounts, raw and unfiltered, revealed the true human toll of punitive measures imposed without evidence. They shared stories of financial ruin, shattered dreams, and a pervasive sense of injustice that had left entire communities distrustful of those in power. The reporters presented compelling statistics, demonstrating that thousands of fines, ranging from a few $100s to tens of thousands, had been wrongly imposed over the past decade. With each tale, it became clearer that the issue wasn't a series of isolated incidents, but a systemic problem that required urgent reform. The public was riveted, and the pressure on local officials intensified to explain, justify, and ultimately fix the flawed processes that had resulted in so many unwarranted penalties. For Jasmine Crockett, the impact of her courtroom victory was profound and far-reaching. She had not only defended her own rights, but also laid a crucial cornerstone in the structure of American justice. Her case became a catalyst for reform, a turning point that exposed the dangers of unchecked administrative power and ignited a nationwide movement to protect citizens from arbitrary enforcement. Legal scholars began referring to her case as a landmark precedent, underscoring that the law must always be founded on evidence, transparency, and fairness. Law schools started incorporating her arguments into their curricula, teaching new generations of lawyers the importance of fighting for due process. Conferences and seminars buzzed with conversations about the need for stricter oversight of municipal enforcement, and policymakers across the country cited her case as a reason to overhaul outdated practices. Jasmine's unwavering determination had transformed her personal battle into a broader crusade for justice, ensuring that every citizen would be better protected from the misuse of power. Across the nation, communities that had once been silenced by bureaucratic indifference now found their voices. The reforms triggered by her case offered hope to those who had suffered under a system that valued authority over fairness. With each rescinded fine and revised policy, the promise of a more just and equitable system began to take shape. The legacy of Jasmine Crockett's victory wasn't measured by grand declarations or fleeting moments of triumph. It was etched into the everyday lives of ordinary people who no longer lived in fear of arbitrary punishment. It became a beacon for future generations, a reminder that when power is left unchecked, it becomes a threat to the rights of the people. But when it is challenged, held accountable, and reformed, that very power can become a force for good, protecting the principles upon which this nation was founded. In the end, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a legal battle. She changed the course of history. Her courage in the face of injustice sparked a movement that re-examined and reformed a system plagued by arbitrary fines and unverified claims. Her victory wasn't a singular moment of triumph, but a spark that ignited widespread reform, one that reshaped how administrative power was exercised, ensuring that every penalty would be backed by evidence and administered fairly. In doing so, she laid a new cornerstone in American justice, one that would stand as a testament to the enduring power of truth, accountability, and the relentless resolve of those who dare to stand against oppression. Her story became a rallying cry for every citizen who had ever felt powerless, a symbol of the truth that when you question authority, demand evidence, and insist on due process, you can indeed change the world. And though the road ahead remained long and filled with challenges, Jasmine Crockett's legacy stood as a reminder that the fight for justice is never truly over, and that even the smallest voice can reverberate loudly enough to reshape an entire nation. Thank you for watching up until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.